Today, we are going to talk about an animated movie that not many people know. However, many are familiar with its sort of predecessor. More on that later. Today, we are talking about The Flight of Dragons. The Flight of Dragons was released in 1982. It was produced by Rankin and animated by the Japanese studio Topcraft. And now we come to the point I mentioned earlier. You do know its predecessor. Just a little earlier, in the same year, they also released The Last Unicorn. Later, we'll discuss how these two films are similar. But first, let's briefly go over the story. In a dark medieval world, the evil wizard Ommeden threatens nature with his destructive power. The last hope rests on Peter, a young man from the 20th century, who is summoned to the past by the wise wizard Carolinus to capture Ommeden's powerful red crown. With a fire-breathing dragon, a rebellious elf, and a noble knight at his side, Peter uses modern logic to fight an ancient evil. Now, the story may sound like typical fantasy at first glance. But that wouldn't do the film justice. After all, it's really about the struggle between logic and magic. In this case, magic can be seen both as a metaphor for nature and for creativity. For example, the Green Wizard mentions that humans will use science, but the inspiration for airplanes, television, and all these modern things comes from magic. People observed fairies flying with their wings and then invented the airplane, or developed the dream of flight. Similarly, inventions like the radio or television trace back to a wizard's crystal orb. In a way, these new inventions make magic obsolete. However, he also says that magical beings must accept this. That's why he plans to create a sort of realm where magic can continue to exist, in peace, far away from technology. However, the Green Wizard Carolinus's brother opposes this view, the Red Wizard Ommeden. He wants to hold up a mirror to humanity, showing how humans use technology and end up destroying themselves. With his dark magic, he seeks to oppress humans. This sets the stage for a classic, but quite interesting, fantasy story. Another key point in the plot is Peter Dickinson's transformation into a dragon. He's a man from the 20th century, fascinated by magic, dragons, and wizardry. When he ends up in this medieval magical past, he's accidentally turned into a dragon, and learns how a dragon works anatomically in the process. And that brings us to the perfect segue, the two source materials for this film. The movie is based on two books, The Flight of Dragons by Peter Dickinson and The Dragon and the George by Gordon R. Dickson. This also explains a bit of the film's problem. On the one hand, it takes a lot of time to explain dragon anatomy, while on the other, it tells a pretty classic fantasy hero's journey. The entire dragon anatomy part comes from The Flight of Dragons, while the story's basic premise comes from The Dragon and the George, though with quite a few liberties taken. Now we come to a point I've been hinting at from the start, the comparison with The Last Unicorn. These films are very easy to compare because both The Flight of Dragons and The Last Unicorn were created by the same team, both in terms of production and animation. What makes these two films particularly interesting is that they are quite different, not only in terms of the classic Disney fairy tale fantasy look, but also in storytelling style. Both films have very dark moments that can range from scary to disturbing, especially for children. The weight of their stories is also quite heavy. For example, in The Flight of Dragons, there's a scene where the evil wizard Ommeden makes a reference to atomic bombs and nuclear destruction, which is definitely a lot for a child expecting a simple fantasy animated film. But now the question arises, which film is actually better? And yes, The Last Unicorn could easily deserve its own video. However, so many YouTubers have already discussed it that I'll focus on other topics for now. Still, I can give my opinion. I think The Last Unicorn is the far better film. The Flight of Dragons has some bold ideas, like its philosophical questions about technology versus nature, creativity, and whether we need imagination to develop technology. But it doesn't fully deliver on these ideas. In contrast, The Last Unicorn follows its themes very consistently. I also think many of the issues I have with The Flight of Dragons come from the fact that it's based on two completely different books, one a non-fiction book about fictional dragon anatomy, and the other a fantasy adventure. They don't always fit together smoothly. Still, the film is definitely worth watching. Before I finish, I want to mention one more thing. Rankin, in collaboration with Topcraft, as any Tolkien enthusiast probably knows, produced The Hobbit and The Return of the King before The Last Unicorn, and of course before The Flight of Dragons. These Tolkien adaptations are also worth a video, as they are extremely unusual and stylistically very similar to these two films. Here's the main point. Topcraft was basically the predecessor of Studio Ghibli. That's why all these Rankin and Topcraft co-productions have a very anime-like style. However, The Flight of Dragons still feels like a transitional work. On one hand, you can see the Japanese anime influence, and on the other, a European-inspired fantasy. For example, the dragon designs in The Flight of Dragons are quite influenced by Asian aesthetics. So, in conclusion, The Flight of Dragons is compelling, even if it isn't perfectly consistent. Its core message can feel a bit naive in places, but the film is definitely worth watching. Thanks for watching.